Story 1. My name is Denny Wachowski, and I drove a coal truck for 11 years out of a little operation in McDowell County before the mine shut down. I want to say up front that I'm not a man who scares easy. I have worked around heavy equipment my whole adult life. I've pulled bodies of coworkers out of collapsed sections when the mine still ran 2 shifts. And I have driven mountain roads and ice storms that would make most people pull over and pray. None of that prepared me for what happened on Route 16 back in October of 2014. And I still, to this day, take a different road home if I can help it, even if it costs me 20 extra minutes. The job itself was simple in theory. Load up at the tipple, run the coal down to the rail siding about 45 minutes away, empty out and head back for another load. Sometimes 4 or 5 runs a night, depending on how far behind we were. I liked the night runs better than most of the other drivers did. Less traffic, cooler engine temps, and honestly, I liked the quiet. I would turn the radio off entirely on the empty runs back. Just me and the diesel engine and the tires on the blacktop, winding through hollows where the tree canopy grows so thick overhead that even at high noon it feels like dusk under there. And at 2 in the morning it is about as dark gets. Just the reach of your headlights and whatever they happen to catch. That night I was coming back empty after my 3rd run. Tired in that specific way you get after a double shift, where your eyes start playing tricks with the shapes at the edge of your headlights. Mailboxes turning into people for half a second, before your brain catches up and corrects itself. I want to be clear that what I saw was not one of those tired-eye tricks, because it did not go away when I blinked. It did not resolve into something mundane the way those things usually do. The road on that stretch cuts through a hollow that locals have always had a strange relationship with. Older guys at the mine used to joke about it, called it the dead patch. Said hunters avoided it, even though the deer population back in there was thick as anywhere else in the county, which if you know anything about hunting culture in West Virginia, tells you something, because hunters do not typically avoid good deer country for no reason. I had heard the jokes for years and never thought much of them. Just old men passing down old stories the way old men do. I was coming around a long bend doing maybe 40, slower than usual because a light fog had settled into the low parts of the hollow, and my headlights caught something standing dead center in my lane, about 100 yards out. My first thought, the automatic thought any driver in coal country has, was deer, because that is 99 times out of 100 what it is going to be. I started easing off the gas, foot covering the brake, doing the mental math on stopping distance the way you do without even realizing you are doing it after enough years behind the wheel. But it did not move like a deer. Deer freeze, sure, caught in the headlights, but there's a specific stillness to a frightened animal, a coiled tension like it might bolt any second in any direction. This was not that. This was a different kind of still, deliberate, like something that had chosen to stand there and had no intention of being startled out of the choice. As I closed the distance to maybe 70 yards, I could make out that it was standing upright on 2 legs, and even at that distance, something about the proportions was wrong in a way my brain kept trying and failing to resolve into anything familiar. Too tall. Way too tall, a good 1.5 feet taller than a big man standing straight, and the legs had a strange backward bend to them at the knee. Not exactly like an animal's hind legs, but not like human legs either. Some in-between geometry that made my stomach drop before my conscious mind had even finished processing what I was looking at. I slowed the truck down to a crawl, maybe 15 miles an hour, closing that last stretch of distance because momentum alone was still carrying me forward, and I honestly did not know what else to do. It did not move. It did not flinch from my headlights the way literally every wild animal I have ever encountered on a night road does. That half step back, that ear twitch, that visible startle response. It just stood there, facing me dead on. And as I got closer, I could see its head was tilted, not down like it was grazing or looking at something on the ground, but tilted to the side at an angle. Almost curious, like it was studying my truck the same way I was studying it. I laid on the horn. Long, hard blast, the kind that echoes off the hollow walls and usually sends every deer within a quarter mile crashing off into the brush. That thing tilted its head the other direction instead, slow, deliberate. And I swear to you, it felt less like a startled reaction and more like it was mocking the sound. Like a person cocking their head at something mildly amusing. I have hauled coal through those mountains at every hour of the night for over a decade at that point. I have seen black bears standing up on their hind legs to sniff at the air. I have seen elk with their antlers catching the light. I have seen bobcats freeze mid-stride crossing the road ahead of me. This was built like a man in the sense that it had that basic bipedal shape, torso, arms, legs, head. But the proportions were wrong everywhere I looked. The arms hung too long, reaching down well past where a human's knees would be. And the whole frame was covered in something that caught the light dull and matted rather than reflecting it clean the way fur usually does. When my high beams caught its eyes directly, they threw back a shine that I have never seen from any animal before or since. Deer eyes flash white or a pale yellowish white when hit with headlights. Cat eyes, bobcat or otherwise, tend toward a greenish gold. This was a pure, saturated green, almost artificial looking, like the chemical glow you get out of a cracked glow stick. And it did not blink. Not once, the entire time I was looking at it. I sat there behind the wheel of an idling coal truck, maybe 40 yards out now, engine rumbling under me. And that thing just stood in my lane, holding my gaze with eyes that did not blink, and a head tilted at an angle that had nothing to do with confusion and everything to do with what felt, even from that distance, like calculation. I sat there maybe 10 seconds. It felt like 10 minutes. My hands were sweating on the wheel despite the fact that the cab was cool. That specific cold sweat you get when your body understands a threat before your mind has finished cataloging why. I remember thinking through my options in a strange, detached way, like part of my brain had stepped outside the moment to analyze it. I could try to reverse, but reversing a loaded position on a curved mountain road in the fog at 2 a.m, with something like that ahead of me did not feel like a real option, especially not knowing if it could move faster than I could back up. I could sit and wait, see if it moved on its own, but every second I sat there felt like it was inviting something I did not want invited. In the end, I made the decision that felt like the only one that gave me any control over the situation at all. I was driving a 14-ton loaded position. Even empty, that truck weighs more than most things in these mountains are built to survive being hit by. And I decided I was not going to sit there and find out what happened if I waited it out. I dropped it into gear and gunned it straight down the lane at the thing, figuring whatever it was, man, animal, or something in between, a coal truck bearing down on it at speed was going to force some kind of reaction. The engine roared, tires caught the wet blacktop, and I watched that thing through the windshield as the distance closed fast, 30 yards, 20, 15. It did not run. It did not scramble out of the way in a panic the way anything with a survival instinct should have. At the last possible second, and I mean the actual last second, close enough that I genuinely believed for one half heartbeat that I was about to hit it. It took one long, unhurried stride off the road and into the tree line, like a person stepping out of the way of a puddle rather than a 14-ton truck bearing down on them at 45 miles an hour. There was no scramble to it, no fear in the movement at all. It moved like it had all the time in the world and had simply chosen, at its own convenience, to no longer be standing in the road. I did not stop. I kept my foot on the gas and took that bend faster than I probably should have on a wet road. And in my side mirror, right before the curve took it fully out of view, I caught one more look. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, exactly where it had stepped off, upright, still facing the road, watching my taillights disappear around the bend, not chasing, not retreating into the woods the way a spooked animal would, just standing there. watching like it wanted me to know it was in no hurry and had gotten exactly what it wanted out of the encounter, whatever that was. I did not stop shaking until I pulled into the yard, back at the tipple, almost 20 minutes later. I sat in the cab for a good 5 minutes before I could make myself get out, running through it over and over, trying to find some rational explanation that fit what I had seen, and coming up empty every single time. I did not say a word to anybody that night. I did not say a word to anybody for a long time, honestly. I did not tell my wife until almost a full year later, and even then I only told her because we were watching some documentary on cable about strange sightings in Appalachia, and I just could not sit there and stay quiet through the whole thing without saying something. She did not laugh at me the way I half expected her to. She just went quiet for a while, and then asked me if I still had bad dreams about it. And I realized I had never told her about those either. The ones where I am back on that stretch of road, and this time the truck stalls out right as it gets close. I kept driving that road for another 2 years before the mine finally shut down for good, and in all that time, I never took Route 16 again after dark, if I had any other option, even if it meant a longer run. On the rare occasions I had no choice but to take it, I kept my brights on the whole way through that hollow, and I did not slow down for anything short of a solid obstacle. And I never once looked in my mirror after passing through, because some part of me was afraid of what I might see standing there, watching me go. I have talked to 2 other drivers from that operation over the years, carefully, without leading them, just asking if they had ever seen anything strange out on the night runs. And both of them got quiet in a way that told me everything I needed to know, even though neither one would say more than that they preferred the day shift for reasons they did not care to get into. There was one conversation, though, that stuck with me more than the others. An older fellow named Hollis, who had worked the mine going on 30 years, retired now, ran into him at a feed store maybe 2 years after my sighting. I brought up the dead patch carefully, framing it as a joke, asking him what the story was behind the name. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than a casual question usually earns, and then he asked me straight out if I had seen something out there. I did not answer right away, and that hesitation was apparently answer enough, because he nodded slowly like a piece had clicked into place for him. He told me the name went back to his father's time working those same hollows, long before the current mine ever opened. Said there used to be a small logging camp back in there in the early part of the last century, and according to the story his father told him, the whole camp emptied out inside of 2 seasons. Men just packing up and leaving, walking off the job with pay still owed to them, rather than spend one more night in those hollows. Nobody ever put a name to what drove them out, at least not one that made it into any record Hollis knew of. But the men who left all told some version of the same thing to anyone who would listen back in town, that something tall watched them from the tree line at night, and that it never came closer than the edge of where their lantern light reached, like it was testing the boundary of how close it could get without being fully seen. Hollis said his father used to tell it more as a cautionary tale about respecting the mountains than as a ghost story, the kind of thing meant to keep young loggers cautious rather than reckless. But he also told me in a low voice, leaning in close enough that I could tell he did not want anyone else in that feed store overhearing, that he himself had driven through there once as a young man, maybe 19 or 20, coming home late from a dance in the next town over, and he had seen something standing in a field just off the road that he never could explain and never told his own wife about, until decades later. He would not describe it to me in detail. He just said it was tall, and it did not move like anything ought to move, and that after that night, he understood exactly why the old loggers packed up their tools and left good wages on the table rather than stay. That conversation did more to settle something in me than it did to unsettle me further, strange as that sounds. I had spent almost 2 years at that point, wondering if I had somehow imagined the whole thing, if exhaustion and fog and a trick of the headlights had conspired to build a monster out of nothing more than a startled buck standing wrong in poor light. Hearing an old man who had no reason to lie to me describe the same essential shape, the same unnatural stillness, the same sense of being deliberately watched from just beyond the light, took away any comfort I might have found in explaining it away. I kept driving that route for another 2 years before the mine finally shut down for good. And in all that time, I never took Route 16 again after dark, if I had any other option, even if it meant a longer run that ate into my hours and my paycheck both. On the rare occasions I had no choice but to take it, I kept my brights on the whole way through that hollow, and I did not slow down for anything short of a solid obstacle blocking the full width of the lane. And I never once looked in my mirror after passing through, because some part of me was afraid of exactly what I might see standing there, watching me go. These days, I drive a delivery route for a building supply company, daylight hours only, and I have made my peace with the pay cut that came with leaving the mine work behind. My wife still asks me sometimes if I ever think about going back out to that stretch of road just to see if anything is there, maybe in broad daylight with a camera, and I tell her the same thing every time. Some things you see once and you are supposed to walk away from, not go looking to confirm. If you asked me to explain what I saw that night in any kind of scientific terms, I could not do it, and I have stopped trying to. I just know that whatever it was not afraid of my truck. It was not afraid of my horn. And it was watching me the entire time with an intelligence behind those green eyes that no deer or bear or bobcat has ever looked at me with in 11 years of night driving through those mountains. And that the men who worked that same ground 100 years before me apparently learned the exact same lesson I did, just in time to still be able to walk away from it. Story 2. My name is Colleen Vasquez, and I work as a home health aide out in rural Pocahontas County, West Virginia, driving between elderly clients scattered across hollows so remote that half of them do not register correctly on any GPS system I have ever used. You learn the routes by memory out there, by landmarks, by counting mailboxes and knowing which gravel fork to take at which broken down barn, because the app on your phone will confidently route you into a creek bed if you trust it past a certain point on the map. This is about a client of mine, an old man named Otis Redmayne, who lived alone at the end of a gravel road so far back that you lost cell signal a full mile before his porch came into view. And what happened on one particular visit that ended his habit of warning me about something for good, because after that night, I never needed the warning explained to me again. I had been assigned to Otis for close to a year by the time everything I'm about to tell you happened. 3 visits a week, checking his vitals, helping with medication, making sure a man living alone at 91 years old was still eating properly and not falling in that old farmhouse, with nobody around to hear him if he did. Otis was sharp for his age in a way that surprised most people who met him. Quick with a story, quicker with a joke. The kind of old-timer who remembered every detail of his childhood, better than he remembered what he had for breakfast that morning. I looked forward to those visits more than most of my rounds, honestly, because he was good company in a job that could otherwise feel isolating and thankless. But every single visit, without exception, before I left, he would walk me to the door, sometimes leaning on his cane, sometimes just steady on his own 2 feet, depending on the day. And he would grab my wrist, not hard, just firm enough to make sure I was listening. And he would say the same thing nearly word for word every time. "Don't you ever come out here after dark, girl? Not if you can help it. And if you ever do end up out here after dark, and something calls your name from the tree line that sounds like me but isn't quite right, you do not answer it, you do not slow down. You keep driving no matter what it says to try and make you stop." I laughed it off the first handful of times he said it gently, the way you do with an elderly client's superstitions, nodding along and telling him I would be careful, without putting much real weight behind the promise. Old mountain folks carry all kinds of old beliefs with them, warnings passed down from parents and grandparents that made sense in a harder, more isolated time, and just never got shed, even as the world around them changed. I respected it as part of who he was, without ever expecting the need to actually heed it. Then one evening in February, my last appointment of the day ran long because his blood pressure reading came back strange, high enough that I did not feel right leaving him alone until I saw it come back down into a safer range. I called it into his doctor's after-hours line, sat with him, checked it every 15 minutes, talked with him to keep him calm while we waited it out together. By the time the numbers finally settled and I felt comfortable leaving, it was fully dark outside, no moon that night. Heavy cloud cover that swallowed up even the faint starlight you usually get out that far from town. Otis grabbed my wrist at the door, same as always, but this time his grip was tighter, and his voice had an edge to it I had not heard from him before. More urgent, less like ritual, and more like genuine fear. He told me to take it slow, keep my windows up, and whatever I did, do not answer if I heard my name. I told him I would be fine, and I mostly believed it, but something about the tightness in his hand stayed with me as I walked out to my car in the dark. The gravel road leading away from his property runs a little over 2 miles before it connects to a paved county road, and for the first stretch of it past his fence line, there is nothing on either side but dense forest pressing close to the road. No other houses, no lights, nothing but trees and the reach of your own headlights. About halfway down that stretch, past where his fence line finally gives out to just unbroken woods on both sides, I heard it. Someone called my name from the trees, and I want to be very clear about how it sounded because it has stuck with me in exact detail ever since. It was not a shout carrying across the distance the way a real voice calling from the woods would sound, muffled by leaves and distance and the natural absorption of open air. It was closer than that, more intimate, like someone had leaned in right up against my closed window and spoken directly into the glass, quiet, almost gentle. It used my full first name, Colleen, drawn out slightly on the second syllable, and that detail alone was enough to send ice straight down my spine, because nobody out that way calls me by my first name. Everyone, without exception, calls me Miss Vasquez or just Miss V if they are being casual, a habit of formality that goes back generations in that community. Whatever called my name that night either did not know that convention or did not care to follow it, and either possibility felt equally wrong. I did not stop the car. Every hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood straight up, and I kept my foot steady and even on the gas, eyes locked forward on the road, deliberately not looking toward the tree line, even though every instinct was screaming at me to check, to confirm, to put a shape or a source to the voice so my mind could categorize it as something explainable. Something deeper than instinct told me that looking would be a mistake, that whatever wanted my attention badly enough to know my given name wanted nothing more than for me to turn my head and look. The voice called again, and this time it was closer. Close enough that it felt like it was keeping pace directly alongside my car, despite the fact that I was doing a steady 35 miles an hour on a gravel road, and nothing human could possibly maintain that pace on foot, through dense forest, without me hearing branches breaking or feet pounding the ground. There was no sound of movement at all, just the voice, keeping perfect pace. And this time there was something almost wounded in the tone, hurt, like it genuinely could not understand why I was not answering, like my silence was some kind of personal slight against it, rather than a survival instinct kicking in. It called a third time as I approached the last curve before the paved road, and this time the tone shifted, softer, almost pleading. Colleen, please, in a cadence that, if I'm being completely honest, sounded uncannily close to Otis's own voice, the same gentle rasp he had, the same particular way he stretched certain vowels. That similarity is what scared me more than anything else about the whole encounter, because it meant whatever was doing this had heard him say my name before, had studied the exact texture and rhythm of his voice closely enough to mimic it, which meant it had been close to that house, close to him, likely on more than one occasion. I made it to the paved county road and did not ease off the gas until I was a solid 5 minutes down the highway with real streetlights and the occasional passing car to remind me I was back in a world that made sense. I sat in my driveway at home for almost 10 minutes afterward, before I could make myself go inside, hands still shaking on the wheel. When I told Otis about it on my next visit 2 days later, he went quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to worry I had upset him. Then he just nodded slowly, like a piece of information he had been waiting a long time to confirm had finally been confirmed, and he said, "That's the one I warned you about, girl. Been calling people down that road since before I was your age. And my daddy told me it was calling people down that road since before he was mine. He said the ones who answer it, who stop the car or call back or go looking for whoever it sounds like, don't come back the same as they left, if they come back at all." He told me about a cousin of his decades back who had pulled over on that same stretch after hearing what he swore was his own late wife calling to him, and who was found 3 days later wandering the county road nearly 20 miles from where his truck was found abandoned, alive but never right in the head again for the remaining years of his life, unable to describe where he had been or what had happened to him in those 3 missing days. In the months between that night and his passing, I found myself unable to let the subject drop entirely. And Otis, once he realized I had actually experienced what he had spent a year warning me about, seemed almost relieved to finally have someone to talk it through with, who would not dismiss him as a confused old man rambling about nothing. Over several visits, he told me more of the history he had never shared before, pieces he said he had been sitting on for decades, because nobody young ever believed him enough to make the telling worthwhile. He said the road itself had been cut through that hollow back in the 1930s as part of a work relief project, crews of men clearing timber and grading gravel through land that, according to the handful of families who had lived in that hollow even earlier, had always been considered off limits after dark by anyone with any sense. His own grandfather had been part of that original road crew, and Otis said the stories that came out of that project were part of the reason the road took nearly 2 full years longer to complete than similar projects in neighboring counties, because crews kept quitting mid-contract, walking off the job, and refusing to come back, no matter what wages were offered to entice them. The specific detail that stuck with me most was something Otis told me just a few weeks before he passed, sitting in his usual chair by the window with a blanket over his knees, speaking slower than usual because his breath had started giving him trouble by then. He said his grandfather had told him that the thing calling out from those woods did not seem to choose names randomly, that it seemed to specifically favor calling out the names of people who had some connection to whoever it called to. Family names, names of people close to the person it was trying to draw out, almost as if it were fishing for whichever voice would land with the most emotional weight and the best chance of getting someone to stop and listen. That was why, Otis explained, he always used my full given name in his warnings rather than a general caution, because he understood by then that it was not calling out randomly. It was calling out deliberately, using whatever version of a name or a voice would cut deepest and land hardest with whoever happened to be driving that road that particular night. He also told me something that I have never been able to fully shake, which is that in the weeks before he passed, he mentioned almost offhandedly that he had started hearing it himself again at night from inside his own house, closer to the property than it had ever come in his memory, calling not his name but mine, softly from somewhere out past his fence line, as though it had shifted its attention in some way he did not fully understand and did not want to speculate about out loud. I do not know what to make of that detail even now. I choose to believe it was simply an old, dying man's mind playing tricks in his final weeks, because the alternative, that something out there had taken a specific and lasting interest in me after that one encounter on the gravel road, is not something I let myself think about for very long at a time. Otis passed away peacefully in his sleep according to the family, and I was reassigned to other clients further toward town after that, routes that did not take me anywhere near that gravel road after dark. A change in assignment I requested myself and did not have to explain much to justify. But I still think about that voice more than I would like to admit, about how precisely it captured his cadence, about how it knew my full given name when almost nobody in that entire community used it, and about how patiently it kept pace with my car, that whole stretch of road, never rushing, never giving up, just calling in that soft, wounded, almost loving tone, like it genuinely believed that eventually, on some night, I would finally stop the car and answer. Some nights, when I'm driving home late from a shift that ran long, I still catch myself checking my rearview mirror on empty stretches of road for no reason I can fully explain, half expecting to hear my name called from somewhere it has no business coming from. A few months after Otis passed, curiosity got the better of me, and I mentioned the whole story, carefully and without much detail, to another aide at the agency who had grown up in that same county her whole life. I expected her to laugh it off or change the subject the way most people do when a story starts sounding too strange to take seriously. Instead, she went pale and told me her own grandmother had refused to let any of the grandchildren walk that stretch of road alone, even in broad daylight, and that there was a small and formal understanding among the older families in that hollow, never spoken about openly to outsiders, that you simply did not answer to your name out there after dark, no matter whose voice it seemed to be wearing. She said her grandmother used to call it the borrowing, the idea being that whatever lived back in those woods borrowed voices, the way a person might borrow a coat, wearing them only long enough to get what it wanted before setting them back down. That conversation did not make me feel any better about what happened, but it did make me feel less alone in it. Less like a woman who had let her nerves get the better of her on one long, dark drive. I have since made it a point, on the rare occasions my work still takes me anywhere near that part of the county after dark, to keep my radio on loud enough to fill the cab of my car completely, windows up regardless of the season, and I never under any circumstances roll them down for anything or anyone until I am somewhere, with real light and real people around me. I do not know what that thing is, or what it wants, or why it seemed to want me in particular after that one encounter, and I have made my peace with never finding out, because the alternative, going looking for answers on a dark road that already knows my name, is not a risk I am willing to take twice. Story 3. My name is Franklin Osei, and I run a small trail maintenance crew out of eastern Kentucky, clearing brush, repairing footbridges, and keeping drainage cuts open along a stretch of backcountry trail system that does not see much foot traffic outside of hunting season, and the occasional serious backpacker who wants solitude badly enough to earn it. I have done this kind of work for going on 12 years, and most of it uneventful in the way physical outdoor labor tends to be. Long days, sore hands, the occasional close call with weather or terrain, but nothing that ever made me question what was actually out there sharing the woods with me. That changed 3 autumns ago, and it changed enough that I still have not fully returned to the version of myself that existed before that 4-day stretch. The job that season was to get ahead on some washed-out sections of trail before the weather turned properly cold, sections where spring flooding had torn out drainage culverts and left long stretches of the path essentially impassable without rerouting. It was solo work by necessity more than choice, budget being what it is for a crew our size, and I'd done solo stretches before, without any particular unease about it. I know how to be alone in the woods. I actually prefer it most of the time, the quiet, the pace of working at your own rhythm without anyone else's schedule to accommodate. I set up camp about half a mile off the main trail near a decent-sized creek that gave me reliable water access for the duration of the Jushu, a spot I had actually used on 2 previous seasons without a single issue. Flat ground, good drainage, close enough to my work site to make the daily hike manageable without eating too much daylight. Nothing about the location struck me as unusual going in, and the first night passed exactly the way you would expect. Tired body, good sleep, up with first light to get to work. The second night is the one that changed everything. I had turned in a little earlier than usual after a hard day of hauling gravel for a drainage repair, and I woke sometime well past midnight. though I cannot tell you the exact hour since I make it a habit not to keep a watch or phone running overnight to save the battery. What woke me was a sound, and I wanted to describe it as precisely as I can, because the precision of it is what has stayed with me all these years later. It was something large moving through the underbrush in a slow, deliberate circle around my tent. Not the quick, startled rustle of a deer or raccoon bumping into camp by accident and bolting once it realized something was there. This was patient, measured, a steady, unhurried crunch of dry leaves and small branches under significant weight, tracing what felt, even just from sound alone, like a complete loop around the full perimeter of my tent before it finally stopped. I laid still, every muscle locked tight, one hand slowly finding the fixed blade knife I always keep within reach when camping alone, more out of habit for dealing with the occasional aggressive raccoon or curious bear than any real expectation of needing it for self-defense against something larger. I listened hard, straining to pick apart the ordinary night sounds of the forest, wind in the canopy, the creek running steady in the background, from whatever had just circled my tent and gone silent. After a few minutes of what felt like complete stillness outside, I heard breathing. Not my own, and I was acutely aware of my own breath at that point, shallow and controlled, trying to keep it as quiet as possible. This was low and wet sounding in a way that is hard to fully put into words. A thick, heavy inhale and exhale that carried a faint rasping edge to it, coming from just outside the tent wall, close enough that with each exhale, I could actually see the thin nylon fabric shift and bow inward slightly, like something had pressed its face directly up against it from the other side, close enough to feel the warmth of its breath through the material if I had reached out my hand. I have worked outdoors my entire adult life, and I know the sound of a black bear snuffling curiously around a camp, that particular huffing, exploratory pattern, as it investigates unfamiliar smells. This was not that. This had a rhythm to it that felt deliberate rather than exploratory. And the longer I lay there listening, the more I became convinced, in a way I cannot fully justify with hard evidence, but which I trusted completely in that moment, that the breathing was matching the pace of my own, slowing when mine slowed, quickening slightly on the two occasions I could not fully suppress a shaky, panicked breath of my own. It felt less like an animal investigating a strange smell and more like something listening to me, mirroring me, the way a person might unconsciously match the breathing pattern of someone they are trying to comfort. Except there was nothing comforting about the wet, heavy rasp of it, pressed up against thin tent fabric in the middle of the night. I did not move. I do not think I fully exhaled a full, normal breath for what felt like an hour, though I'm sure it was less time than that in reality, fear having a way of stretching minutes into something far longer feeling. Eventually the breathing pulled back, receding from the tent wall, and I heard that same slow, deliberate crunch of leaves moving away into the surrounding brush, unhurried, taking its own sweet time about leaving the way it had taken its time arriving. And then nothing. Just the creek, the wind, and my own heartbeat pounding loud enough in my ears that I was half convinced it could be heard from outside. I did not sleep again that night. I laid there with my knife gripped tight until the first gray hint of dawn light started filtering through the tent fabric. And only then did I finally work up the nerve to unzip the flap and look outside. What I found circling the entire perimeter of my tent, pressed into the soft mud near the creek bank, and the slightly firmer ground further out, were tracks. Barefoot-looking impressions, but easily 14 inches long by my own rough measurement, using my boot as a reference. Toes splayed unnaturally wide apart in a way no human foot is built to spread, and pressed deep enough into the ground, in some spots, nearly 2 inches deep, in soft mud that my own boots barely dented walking the same path, that whatever left them was carrying serious weight, far more than the track length alone would suggest for a normal biped. I followed the tracks a short distance, maybe 30 or 40 feet, driven by some combination of professional habit and horrified curiosity, before they simply stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop, where the ground turned too hard to hold an impression and I lost the trail entirely. What struck me most, studying those prints in the gray early light before I made myself stop looking at them, was how evenly spaced the stride length was. A consistent gap between each print that suggested a smooth, controlled gait rather than the lumbering, uneven stride you would expect from something moving on all fours, occasionally rearing up, or from a bear walking upright for a short stretch out of curiosity the way they sometimes do. This moved like something built for walking upright as its default posture, not as an occasional novelty. I also noticed, and this detail took me longer to fully process, because I did not want to accept what it implied, that at several points around the tent, the prints doubled back on themselves in tight, overlapping patterns, as if whatever made them had paused in specific spots for an extended period, shifting its weight from foot to foot, the way a person does when standing still for a long time, rather than simply passing through in one continuous circuit. Two of those overlapping clusters were positioned directly across from each other on opposite sides of the tent, and one more sat almost precisely where my own head had been resting inside, separated only by that thin layer of tent fabric and a few inches of empty air. I did not go looking further. I packed my entire camp in record time, moving faster than I think I have ever broken down a site before in 12 years of doing this work, stuffing gear into my pack without the usual care I take to keep things organized, and hiked the half-mile back to the trailhead at something close to a jog despite the weight on my back. I threw everything into my truck, sat behind the wheel for a solid minute just breathing, and then called my crew lead from the first spot on the drive out, where I picked up enough signal to get a call through, telling him I had a family emergency and needed to head home early, cutting the planned 4-day job down to 2. He did not question it much at the time, and I never corrected the story later, because the truth felt like something that would cost me more credibility than it was worth explaining to a man who had never had reason to doubt my judgment before. I still do trail work in that region to this day, and I've gone back to work sections of that same trail system more times than I could easily count since that night. But I have never camped solo out there again, not once, and I never will, no matter how tight the budget gets or how much extra driving it costs me to commute in and out each day instead. The strangest part of the whole aftermath, though, happened almost 8 months later, well into the following spring, when I was back working a different section of that same trail system with a 2-person crew for once, instead of solo. My coworker that day, a younger guy named Tobias, who had only been with us about a season, mentioned offhand while we were breaking for lunch that he had heard from some hunters at the gas station in town about a section of woods nearby that locals apparently called the Listening Hollow, a stretch of forest where several people over the years had reported the exact same sensation, that something out there mimicked the sound of their own breathing back at them at night, close enough to hear through a tent wall. He had no idea I had experienced anything like that myself, and was just repeating gas station gossip he found amusing enough to bring up. I asked him as casually as I could manage whether he knew exactly where that hollow was supposed to be, and when he described the general location based on what he had been told, it was close enough to my old camp spot from that autumn, maybe 1.5 miles off at most, that I do not believe it was coincidence. I did some quiet digging after that, nothing exhaustive, just conversations here and there with people who had lived in that county longer than I had. What I pieced together is that this is not an isolated experience tied only to my one bad night. Multiple people, spread out over what sounded like a couple of decades at minimum, have described some version of the same thing in that general stretch of forest. Something large that circles a camp in the dark, breathes in a way that mimics the person inside the tent, and leaves oversized barefoot tracks that never seem to lead anywhere useful when followed. Nobody I talked to could tell me what it actually is. Most people just call it the thing in the hollow, or do not call it anything at all. preferring simply not to discuss it beyond a knowing look and a change of subject. I have told exactly two people this full story in the years since it happened, both of them longtime hunters from that area, and neither one laughed or brushed it off the way I half expected them to. One of them just nodded slowly and told me there is a reason certain hollows in that region stay conspicuously empty of deer sign, even though the terrain and forage look perfect for supporting a healthy population. Like something bigger than a deer has been keeping that particular patch of woods for itself. And the deer, smarter than us in that regard, learned a long time ago to stay well clear of it. I think about that conversation every single time my work takes me anywhere near that stretch of trail. And I make absolutely certain, every single time, that I am never the last one still working when the light starts to fail. There is one more detail I have never told anyone, not even the two hunters I confided in, because it is the one piece of the whole experience that I still cannot make sense of, no matter how many times I turn it over in my mind. In the weeks after that night, back home and trying to convince myself the whole thing had some rational explanation I simply had not thought of yet, I noticed I'd picked up a habit I did not have before. A tendency to unconsciously hold my breath for a beat and listen closely whenever I was in a quiet room alone, as if some part of me was still waiting to hear an answering breath from somewhere just out of sight. My wife noticed it before I ever mentioned the incident to her. Asked me more than once why I kept going still and quiet mid-conversation, like I was listening for something. I never had a good answer for her at the time. I do now, even if it is not one I particularly like admitting to myself. And it is simply this, that whatever matched its breathing to mine that night in the woods left something behind in me that has not fully let go since. A small, persistent piece of that stillness that I carry with me even now, years removed from the actual encounter, waiting without meaning to for a sound I hope to never hear again. There is a broader pattern I have come to notice since that night as well, small enough that I never would have connected it consciously if the original encounter had not made me so much more attentive to my own reactions in the woods. On solo jobs since then, even in sections of forest, completely unrelated to that original hollow, I catch myself occasionally pausing mid-task, tools set down, listening hard to nothing in particular, some low-level vigilance that never used to be part of how I worked before that autumn. My crew lead has noticed it too, commented once, half joking, that I check the tree line more than any other worker he has ever had on staff. I have never told him why, and I do not plan to but I have made my peace with carrying that particular habit for the rest of my career, because whatever changed in me that night in the tent, it has never once led me wrong since, and in this line of work, alone in a remote forest more often than not, I have decided that trusting it is a far better bet than trying to talk myself back out of it. If these first three already have you checking your locks, wait until you hear the rest, because they only get worse from here. Smash that like button right now before you keep scrolling. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who have their own stories to send in. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next upload, and drop a comment telling me which stories so far got under your skin the most. Alright, let's keep going. Story 4. My name is Rhonda Petrocelli, and I have been a long-haul trucker for almost 2 decades now, mostly running produce and dry goods on routes that cut through the mountains between Tennessee and North Carolina, occasionally spilling over into Virginia, depending on how the load schedules line up. 2 decades behind the wheel teaches you a lot about the specific character of different roads, which stretches carry a certain feel to them even before anything happens, and which ones are just ordinary miles you barely register passing. This story happened on a stretch of old 2-lane highway I used to take as a shortcut to shave time off a regular delivery run, a road I do not take anymore, under any circumstances, not for time savings, not for anything. It was maybe 4 in the morning when it happened, deep into a run I had started the previous evening, running on the kind of tired where your body starts negotiating with you about how much longer it can hold out. Thick fog had settled low into the valley, the way it does out there on certain nights when the temperature and humidity line up just right. Visibility dropping to almost nothing beyond the reach of my own headlights. That particular gray soup that swallows the road 10 or 15 feet ahead of your hood and makes the whole world feel like it has shrunk down to just the small bubble of light you are dragging along with you. I had my speed down low, hazards flashing, taking it as careful as the situation demanded. My CB radio crackled to life on a channel that had been dead silence for the better part of 2 hours, which itself was not unusual for that time of night on that particular stretch. Hardly any other trucks running that route at 4 in the morning. A voice came through clear, almost too clear given the fog and the general static you expect from CB transmission in mountainous terrain, asking for help, saying they had run off the road further up and needed somebody to stop and lend a hand. Something about that voice sat wrong with me immediately before I had even fully processed the words. It had the cadence of a real person in genuine distress, panicked in the right places, breathless in the right places, but there was an underlying flatness running beneath all of it that I could not quite name at the time. Something like a recording of real emotion being played back with a slight, almost imperceptible delay between the words and the feeling they were supposed to be carrying, like watching a movie where the audio has drifted just barely out of sync with the picture. I did not respond. Every instinct, built up over 2 decades of night driving, told me to keep my speed steady, my eyes on the fog line marking the edge of the lane, and my hand well clear of that CB microphone. About a quarter mile further down the road, the voice came back, and this time, it used the name painted on my truck door, my full company name, spelled correctly, spoken with the exact right emphasis a person familiar with that company would use. That is information you cannot look up on a whim, in the middle of nowhere, at 4 in the morning with no cell signal and no way to search anything. Not unless you were already close enough to have read the lettering off the side of my trailer as I passed, which meant either a real person had seen my truck go by recently and was now somehow ahead of me on a road with no side turns for miles, or something else entirely was responsible for knowing that detail. The voice said, "Please, I can see your lights. Why won't you stop?" And there was an edge of something almost like hurt in the tone. Wounded, personal, the exact same unsettling quality I have since heard described by other people who have shared their own strange encounters. From these mountains, that particular note of performed emotional injury meant to guilt a person into stopping. I have been driving trucks long enough at that point to trust my gut over almost anything else available to me in the moment, more than logic, more than the urge to be a helpful person to someone apparently in trouble, and my gut told me clearly and without hesitation that whatever was talking to me over that radio had no vehicle, had never been in any accident, and had no genuine need of my help whatsoever. I kept driving, keeping my eyes locked on the fog line, refusing to let my gaze wander toward the shoulder of the road, even as the voice continued calling out at intervals, growing slightly more insistent each time. The please stretching out longer, the why won't you stop taking on a rawer edge that almost sounded like it was building toward something closer to anger the longer I refused to engage. I radioed my dispatch the second I picked up enough signal to get a call through, still a solid 40 minutes further down the road, shaken enough that my voice came out unsteady when I explained what had happened. They pulled up records for that stretch of highway and confirmed there had been no accident reported on that road that night, nor any night in the preceding month according to the local incident log they had access to through their usual channels. No wrecked vehicle, no injured driver, nothing that matched what that voice on my radio had described in such convincing, panicked detail. Truckers talk to each other more than most outsiders probably realize, trading information at truck stops and way stations, the way any close-knit working community does. And when I brought this experience up cautiously, a few weeks later at a stop along my usual route, testing the waters to see if anyone else had a similar story, before committing to telling my own in full. An older driver I had known casually for years went quiet and serious in a way I had not seen from him before. He told me flatly that stretch of highway has a reputation going back further than either of us had been driving, and that the smart drivers, the ones who have been doing this long enough to know better, just keep their speed steady and keep driving no matter what comes over the radio out there, no matter how convincing it sounds, no matter how much it seems to know about you or your truck or your route. He told me his own story too, reluctantly, after I pushed a little. Said years back, before he switched to a different route entirely to avoid that stretch. He had actually stopped once, early in his career before he knew any better, pulled over onto the shoulder in response to a voice calling for help that sounded exactly like his own brother, using a nickname only close family used. He said he got out of the cab, flashlight in hand, calling out into the fog, and found absolutely nothing. No wrecked car, no injured person. Just empty roadside, and thick fog swallowing his flashlight beam more completely than fog should ever swallow direct light. He said the voice called to him one more time from somewhere close behind him in the fog, using that same nickname, close enough that he felt certain if he turned around fast enough, he might actually see who or what was standing there. He did not turn around. He got back in his truck as fast as his legs would carry him and drove off without ever looking back. And to this day, he will not run that stretch of highway even in broad daylight, if there's any alternate route available to him, no matter how much extra time it costs. I have taken the interstate the long way around that stretch ever since my own encounter, adding a solid 90 minutes to that particular delivery run every single time. And I have never once regretted the extra time or the extra fuel cost that comes with it. I've told my dispatch office I simply prefer the interstate route for safety reasons related to road conditions, which is not exactly a lie, just not the complete truth either. What I have never told dispatch, and what I have only shared with a small handful of other drivers who I trust enough to take it seriously instead of laughing me off the CB entirely, is what happened about 6 months after that first encounter, when a scheduling emergency forced my hand and left me with no route available except that same stretch of old highway, just once, just for a single run, with a promise to myself that I would make it quick and keep my radio off entirely the whole way through. I kept that promise about the radio. I drove that stretch in complete silence. No CB, no music, windows up, speed steady, refusing to give whatever lived out there in that fog any opening at all. About 2/3 of the way through, in the exact same low-lying section of valley where the fog always sits thickest, my headlights caught something standing on the shoulder ahead. Not in the road itself this time, just standing at the very edge where the asphalt gives way to gravel and grass, facing the road, facing my truck as I approached. I did not get a clear look at it. The fog was too thick, and I was not about to slow down to improve my view. But the shape was tall, taller than any person standing casually on a shoulder waiting for help would need to be, and it did not move at all as my lights swept across it. No wave, no flag for help, no shift of weight. Nothing but stillness aimed directly at my approaching headlights. I kept my foot steady on the gas and did not so much as touch the brake, and in my mirror for just a half second before the fog swallowed it back up, I thought I saw it take one single step forward onto the asphalt itself, right into the lane I had just vacated, unhurried, like it had been waiting the whole time for exactly that moment to finally move. I made it through the rest of that stretch faster than I probably should have, and I've never taken that road again since, not for any emergency, not for any scheduling crisis, not for any amount of money a dispatcher could offer me to make an exception. I brought up that second encounter to the same older driver I had confided in after the first one, and this time he did not have a story of his own to match it, but he did have a theory, one he said he had pieced together from years of listening to other drivers talk in low voices at truck stops up and down that region. He said the general understanding among the drivers who know about that stretch is that Whatever is out there does not actually need you to stop for it to get something out of the encounter. He said the calling itself, the trying, seems to be enough to satisfy it most nights, a kind of testing of the waters, and that it only escalates to actually showing itself, actually stepping into the road, when it has been ignored enough times in a row that it starts to take the refusal personally. Whether or not that theory holds any real truth to it, I cannot tell you, but it fit uncomfortably well with the timeline of my own two encounters. The first one just a voice testing for a response. The second one a physical presence, stepping directly into my path after I had denied it twice. I do not know what that thing actually wants from the drivers who pass through there. Whether it is hunger in some form or just a kind of predatory curiosity testing which travelers can be lured off the road and which ones know better than to stop. I have thought a lot in the years since about why that stretch specifically, out of all the miles of mountain highway I have run in 20 years of trucking. It is not the most isolated road I drive regularly. It is not the one with the worst cell coverage. It is not even the foggiest valley in my normal rotation, though the fog there does seem to sit heavier and linger longer than it has any real meteorological reason to. My best guess, for whatever it is worth, is that it has simply been doing this a long time, long enough to have gotten good at it, long enough to know exactly which details to reach for to make a voice sound convincing, a name sound familiar, a plea for help sound like the kind of thing a decent person cannot in good conscience ignore. That is what scares me more than the tall shape on the shoulder or the wrongness underneath the recorded sounding voice. It is the patience of it, the practiced quality, like a con that has been refined over years or decades or longer, waiting on that same stretch of fog for the next driver who has not yet learned better. I have made a habit since all of this happened of telling this story to newer drivers when I get the chance, carefully, without expecting them to fully believe me, just planting the seed the way that older driver planted it in me. Most of them nod politely and file it away as an old trucker's superstition, the kind of story that gets traded at truck stops the same way ghost stories get traded around campfires, entertaining but ultimately harmless. A few of them, though, the ones who have already had some small unexplainable thing happen to them out on these roads, get quiet in a very specific way when I tell it. And those are the ones I make sure to give the exact mile marker to, so they know precisely which stretch to avoid, no matter what excuse gets offered to send them down it. Some roads you learn to respect after one lesson. That one took 2 lessons for me, and I have made absolutely certain there will never be a third, no matter what excuse eventually gets offered to try and put me back on that stretch of highway again. I still run the CB on every other stretch of highway I drive regularly, out of habit as much as necessity, and I still stop for genuine emergencies when I come across them. Broken down vehicles with hazards flashing, real people waving flashlights on a real shoulder, in a spot where a person could actually have run off the road. I have not lost my willingness to help strangers in trouble, and I do not want anyone hearing the story to think that stretch of highway turned me into someone who drives past real emergencies out of fear. What it did instead was teach me the difference, a difference I did not fully understand, before that fog rolled in one particular night, between a voice that needs help and a voice that only wants you to stop. And I have carried that distinction with me on every single mile I have driven since, on that road and every other one. Story 5. My name is August Reinhold, and I'm a wildlife camera technician employed through a small research group studying black bear population density and movement patterns across a handful of counties in West Virginia. My job in simple terms is placing and maintaining a network of motion-triggered trail cameras across a wide swath of forest, hiking a rotating circuit to swap memory cards and batteries, checking mounting hardware, and occasionally relocating units to chase reported bear activity that the data suggests might be worth a closer look. It is quiet, methodical work most of the time, the kind of job where the strangest thing you typically encounter is a curious cub investigating a camera housing a little too closely. This story is the exception to that, the one thing in 4 seasons of fieldwork that I still have not found any way to fully explain, and honestly do not want to. The camera in question was mounted deep in a hollow that had, for reasons nobody on our team could pin down at the time, gone unusually quiet over a roughly 3-week stretch. No activity logged at all, not even the usual raccoon or possum triggers that make up the bulk of nuisance footage on any given unit. That kind of total silence was strange for a spot that had reliably caught something every night or two since we first set the camera the previous spring. Enough activity that it had actually been one of our better performing sites for bear signs specifically. A complete dead zone like that usually means one of 2 things in this line of work. Either the unit has malfunctioned in some way that stopped it triggering properly, or something has changed in that immediate area significant enough to push wildlife traffic elsewhere entirely, a new predator moving through, a change in food source, something disrupting the normal patterns. I hiked in alone on a gray, overcast October afternoon to swap the memory card and check the batteries. A solo trip that was entirely normal for this kind of routine maintenance. Nothing about the assignment itself raised any flags going in. The hike back to that particular hollow takes close to 2 hours each way over rough terrain. Enough that solo trips were standard practice simply for scheduling efficiency. And I'd made that same hike alone probably a dozen times over the preceding 2 seasons without incident. When I finally reached the camera, it was still mounted correctly on its tree, strapped secure, housing intact. Nothing obviously disturbed or tampered with in any way that would explain the sudden drop-off in triggers. But there was a smell in that hollow, unlike anything I had encountered in years, of fieldwork across dozens of similar sites, something like wet matted fur mixed with a deep, heavy rot, thick enough in the still October air that it caught in the back of my throat and made me want to breathe through my mouth rather than my nose. I have smelled plenty of dead animals in the woods over the years, deer carcasses, the occasional bear that did not survive the winter. And this had a similar rotten undertone, but layered with something else entirely, something almost chemical or musky underneath the decay that I could not place against anything familiar. I did not linger to investigate the source. I worked quickly, swapped the memory card, replaced the batteries, and started the 2-hour hike back out at a noticeably faster pace than I had hiked in. I did not look at the retrieved footage that same day. Field days are long, and by the time I made it back to the small research cabin our team used as a base during the study season, I was more interested in dinner and sleep than reviewing card contents, a task I usually saved for evenings when I had proper time to sit with the laptop and go through everything methodically. It was not until that night, sitting alone at the cabin's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the memory card loaded into my laptop, that I actually reviewed what that camera had captured during its 3 weeks of apparent silence. Most of the card was exactly what the trigger log had suggested. Empty frames, nothing tripping the motion sensor for days at a stretch, which on its own was unusual enough to note in my field report. Then, near the end of the card's timestamped sequence, I found something that had triggered the camera at 2:47 in the morning, just 2 nights before my visit to service the unit. The first frame showed nothing unusual at a glance, just the dark tree line lit up by the camera's infrared flash the way every night trigger looks, black and white, grainy, familiar. Then over the course of the sequence, something entered the frame from the left edge close to the lens, too close for a camera positioned to capture wider forest activity from a reasonable distance. It was not any animal I could identify from 4 seasons of reviewing thousands of hours of trail camera footage across this exact region. It was covered in matted, uneven fur, patchy in places in a way that made me think of mange, except the overall silhouette was entirely wrong for anything with 4 legs. It moved upright on 2 legs with an odd, hitching gait, a kind of stutter step that did not match the smooth walking pattern of a bear on its hind legs, which is itself a rare and brief posture for bears rather than a sustained way of moving. This thing walked upright as its default, awkward and hitching, but clearly its normal mode of locomotion rather than a temporary balancing act. In the final 2 frames of the sequence, before the trigger cut off entirely, its face filled almost the entire camera view, close enough that I could make out individual details even through the grain of the infrared image. Pale eyes catching the infrared flash with a flat, reflective shine, unlike anything in our extensive bare photo library, staring directly into the lens with what felt even reduced to grainy black and white pixels on a laptop screen at midnight, like genuine comprehension. Not the startled, confused expression of an animal that has accidentally triggered a flash it does not understand. This looked deliberate, like it understood precisely what the device was, understood it was being recorded, and had decided, for reasons I cannot begin to guess at, that it wanted to be seen clearly before it moved on. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after those frames ended, coffee gone cold, laptop screen the only light in the room, running the sequence back 3 or 4 times trying to find some rational explanation my tired brain had missed on first viewing. I found none. I sent the footage to my research lead that same night with a message that probably read more frantic than I intended, and she forwarded it to a colleague at a partner university the following morning for a second opinion, standard practice whenever field data throws up something genuinely unexplained. Within a week, the file had mysteriously corrupted on every single drive it had been copied to, unreadable, unrecoverable, despite 3 separate people at 3 separate institutions having handled backup copies through completely unrelated systems. Our IT contact chalked it up to a bad sector propagating through repeated copies. A plausible enough technical explanation on its own, except that no other file on any of those same drives, copied at the same time through the same processes, showed any similar corruption. Just that one sequence, gone entirely, on every copy that existed. I still have the original memory card itself sitting in a drawer at my home, and I have not tried to view it again since that first night. Some combination of superstition and genuine unease keeping me from ever reinserting it into a card reader. I no longer service that particular camera route. I requested a reassignment to a different section of our study area the following month, and did not offer much explanation beyond a vague preference for terrain closer to the trailhead, which my supervisor accepted without much follow-up questioning. I have not been back to that specific hollow since, and based on internal conversations I have overheard since then, the camera itself was eventually pulled from service entirely, officially due to a persistent equipment malfunction that nobody on the technical side could ever fully diagnose or repair. About a year later, at a wildlife biology conference where several of us from the research group had gone to present preliminary findings from an unrelated portion of the study, I ended up in a late-night conversation at the hotel bar with a field technician from a completely separate bear research program operating in a different part of the Appalachian Range, several states away from our own study area. Conversation drifted the way it does after a few drinks among people who share the same strange, isolating profession, and somehow we landed on the topic of the strangest things either of us had ever captured on a trail camera. I told a heavily sanitized version of my story, leaving out the specific location and most of the identifying detail, just the broad strokes, an upright figure, pale reflective eyes, a face filling the frame like it wanted to be seen. He went quiet for a moment, then told me in a much lower voice than the rest of our conversation had been conducted in, that he had something almost identical happen to a colleague of his 2 seasons back. Different mountain range entirely, different state. No possible connection between our 2 research programs beyond the general similarity of the work. Same basic shape, same upright hitching gait, same unsettling directness in how it looked into the lens right before the recording ended. His colleague's footage, he said, had also mysteriously become corrupted within days of being shared beyond a very small initial circle, Though in his case, it had happened to the original card itself rather than to backup copies, the files simply becoming unreadable overnight, with no clear technical cause anyone could identify. Neither of us had a good explanation for what connects two completely unrelated field programs, having such similar experiences hundreds of miles apart, other than the obvious and deeply unsettling possibility that whatever we were both looking at is simply more widespread across these mountains than either of our individual research programs or the broader scientific community currently accounts for. We exchanged contact information that night, half joking about starting an informal file sharing network for exactly this kind of footage, and never followed up, which in hindsight might have been its own kind of quiet decision neither of us wanted to examine too closely. I have thought many times since about what it actually means that the footage seems to consistently degrade or vanish shortly after being captured and shared, as if whatever we recorded that night in the hollow does not simply avoid cameras the way a genuinely camera-shy animal would, staying out of frame, keeping its distance. This did the opposite. It approached close enough to fill the frame entirely, held its position long enough for multiple clear exposures, and then, once documented, ensured through some means I cannot begin to explain, that the documentation itself would not survive long past the initial viewing. I do not know if that is deliberate in any sense that would apply to an animal, or something else entirely operating by rules I do not have a framework to understand. What I do know is that 4 seasons into this line of work, that is the only footage I've ever reviewed that made me request a reassignment the very next morning without giving my supervisor the real reason why. I've gone back and forth many times over whether to simply destroy that memory card entirely rather than keep it sitting in a drawer in my house, a decision that probably sounds irrational to anyone who has not sat alone at midnight watching something look directly into a lens, like it understood exactly what it was doing. Some nights I convince myself the smart thing to do is drive out to a bridge somewhere and drop it into deep water, be done with it completely, stop giving it a physical presence in my life at all. Other nights I tell myself that destroying it feels like it would be its own kind of acknowledgement, an admission that the thing on that footage deserves the power of making me afraid enough to act, and some stubborn part of me does not want to give it that. So it stays in the drawer, and I'd stay away from that hollow. And 4 seasons into a career built entirely around documenting wildlife I have never fully told, I remain the only person on my research team who knows the real reason a perfectly good camera site got pulled from our study rotation. And I intend to keep it that way for as long as I can manage. I sometimes think about the fact that trail cameras across this whole region, thousands of them between all the various research groups, hunting outfitters, and hobbyists running their own private units on their own land, are silently gathering footage every single night of things nobody will ever review closely enough to notice. Most of it genuinely mundane, deer and raccoons and the occasional curious bear. But scattered somewhere among all of those countless hours of unreviewed footage, I have to assume, are more sequences like mine. More pale, reflective eyes filling more frames. More faces that understood exactly what they were looking into. Most of that footage will simply never be watched by anyone with the patience or the bad luck to actually notice. And most of what does get noticed will probably corrupt itself into silence, the same way mine did before it can spread very far. I do not know if that thought is meant to comfort me or unsettle me further. Most days, if I'm honest, it manages to do a fair amount of both at once. Story 6. My name is Priya Dolman, and I inherited my grandmother's farmhouse in a remote part of eastern Tennessee a few years back after she passed away. And I moved in with the intention of fixing the place up over a summer or two and eventually putting it on the market, since the location was too far from my job to make a permanent move practical long term. What I found in that house, and specifically beneath it, changed those plans considerably. and I still have not managed to sell the property. Though at this point that has less to do with market conditions and more to do with a growing reluctance to hand it off to a family who has no idea what they might be inheriting along with the land. The house itself was fairly ordinary by the standards of that region. A farmhouse built sometime in the early part of the last century, added onto in pieces over the decades by successive generations, my grandmother having lived there for close to 60 years by the time she passed. I had visited as a child plenty of times, but had never paid much attention to the layout beyond the rooms I actually used. And it was only once the place was legally mine, deed transferred, keys in hand, that I started properly exploring corners of the house I had simply never had reason to investigate before. The root cellar beneath the kitchen was one of those corners. I remembered vaguely that it existed, accessed through a trapdoor set into the kitchen floor near the pantry, but I also remembered more clearly that my grandmother had kept it padlocked for as long as I could recall. An actual physical padlock, threaded through a hasp, bolted to the trapdoor, which even as a child struck me as an unusual level of security for what was presumably just a cold storage space for preserves and root vegetables. She never explained the lock when I asked as a kid, just told me it was not a place for children and left it at that. The kind of answer that satisfies a child's curiosity just enough to end the conversation without actually answering anything. I found the key eventually, tucked into a small tin in her sewing kit alongside various buttons and spools of thread, and I opened that cellar mostly out of simple curiosity once the house was fully mine. No particular sense of dread going into it, just the ordinary interest of someone finally getting to see a space that had been off limits her whole life. The cellar itself was unremarkable at first glance. Low ceiling, dirt floor, wooden shelves lining two of the walls holding rows of canning jars gone cloudy and unidentifiable with age. The ordinary detritus of a farmhouse cellar that had clearly not been actively used in a long time, maybe decades, based on the dust and cobwebs layered over everything. What was strange, and what I did not notice until I had been in there several minutes, adjusting to the dim light of the single bulb I had rigged up, was a series of markings carved deep into the wooden support beam nearest the back wall of the cellar. Tally marks, the simple kind everyone learns as a child. 4 vertical lines with a 5th struck diagonally through them to mark a group of 5. Except there were hundreds of these groupings covering nearly the entire visible surface of that beam, going back further in apparent age than I could easily estimate, just from looking at the weathering and discoloration of the wood. Some of the carvings, clearly much older and more worn than others, closer to the surface, suggesting they had been added to gradually over what looked like a very long span of time, possibly generations, rather than just my grandmother's own lifetime. Beside the tallies carved in shaky, uneven letters that looked like they had been cut slowly and carefully, rather than in a single confident pass, were the words, "Don't let it hear you cry." I stood in that cellar for a long time after reading that, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the actual temperature of the space, trying to make sense of what I was looking at and coming up with nothing that felt satisfying. I found my grandmother's old journal in a trunk upstairs a few days later, going through the accumulated belongings of a lifetime the way you do when settling an estate, and I read enough of it over several evenings to understand that she had genuinely believed something lived in the woods behind the property, something drawn specifically to sounds of distress and crying in particular, and that she had trained herself, and later my mother growing up in that same house, to never make that sound outdoors after dark no matter what happened, no matter how badly hurt or how deeply upset, because the consequence of forgetting that rule was apparently worse than whatever pain or grief had prompted the sound in the first place. The journal entries about it were sparse and careful, written in a tone that suggested she did not fully trust even her own private pages with too much detail. But the fear underlying the entries was unmistakable, real and consistent across years of writing rather than a single isolated episode of panic. I will admit that my first instinct, reading those entries, was to interpret it as grief talking, an old woman's coping mechanism built up after losing my grandfather relatively young, decades earlier. Some private ritual of control and superstition that had helped her process a loss too large to fully sit with directly. That explanation felt comfortable, rational, the kind of thing a modern person raised to trust science over superstition wants to believe about an elderly relative's private fears. I held on to that comfortable explanation for the better part of a year living in that house. Right up until this past spring, when I learned firsthand exactly how wrong I had been to dismiss it. I was out back at dusk one evening in April, working alone on a fence line along the rear property boundary that had rotted through badly enough to need full replacement before I could responsibly consider selling the place. I was pulling a stubborn old board free from a post when it gave way suddenly, and my finger caught badly between two boards as they snapped back together, a sharp, genuine pain that pulled a short, involuntary cry out of me before I had any chance to stop myself. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary sharp yelp anyone makes when they smash a finger hard enough to draw blood. The woods behind the property went immediately silent. I want to emphasize how unnatural that silence was because dusk in that part of Tennessee is normally full of sound. Birds settling for the night, insects starting their evening chorus, the general low hum of a healthy forest, transitioning from day to night activity. All of it simply stopped, all at once, for a solid 30 seconds that felt, standing there with my throbbing finger forgotten entirely, like the longest 30 seconds of my life. Then, from somewhere back in the tree line, distance hard to judge but closer than I would have liked, came an answering sound. A low, broken wail that mimicked my own cry of pain almost perfectly in its initial pitch and shape, but stretched out far longer than any human cry naturally would, dragging on and on past the point where a real person would have needed to take a breath, like something was replaying the sound on a loop, slowed down just slightly, practicing the shape of it, trying to get the imitation exactly right through repetition. I did not wait to hear a second one. I do not fully remember covering the distance from the fence line back to the house, only that I was inside with the door locked and my back pressed against it before I had consciously processed what I had just heard, finger still bleeding, forgotten entirely in the adrenaline of the moment. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time that night, staring at the trapdoor to the root cellar, thinking about those hundreds of tally marks, and finally understanding, in a way that reading my grandmother's careful journal entries had not quite managed to make real for me, exactly what each one of those marks represented. I have since fully adopted my grandmother's old habit, treating it not as superstition anymore, but as the hardest, most literal kind of practical advice. Never making a sound of distress outdoors after dark on that property no matter what happens. Biting down through pain, swallowing grief, holding silent through fear, because I now understand with complete certainty what the alternative sounds like, answering back from the tree line. I have not gone back into that root cellar since that night in April, and I do not intend to. The tally marks feel entirely different to me now than they did on that first curious visit. Less like an old woman's private record of survival and more like a running count of every single time, across what must have been decades, that she or someone before her almost forgot the rule herself and had to carve one more mark to remind whoever came after her exactly how close a call it truly was. I reached out to a distant cousin on my mother's side a few weeks after the fence line incident, someone who had grown up visiting that same property regularly as a child during summers, hoping she might remember something useful from those visits that could help me understand the history better. She remembered the padlocked cellar too, and more than that, she remembered an incident from when she was maybe 7 or 8 years old, playing out back near that same tree line, with a cousin closer to her own age, when the other child had taken a bad fall and started crying loudly enough to draw immediate, frantic attention from every adult within earshot of the house. She said my grandmother had come running faster than she had ever seen an adult move, snatched the crying child up bodily, and hauled her inside without a single word of comfort or explanation. An urgency that had frightened my cousin far more at the time than the actual fall itself had, precisely because it made no sense to a child who did not yet understand what her grandmother clearly already knew. My cousin also mentioned, almost as an afterthought near the end of our conversation, that she had always assumed the padlocked cellar was simply where my grandmother kept something valuable, jewelry or family documents, the kind of ordinary reason a person locks a room. She had never once considered, until I explained what I had found carved into that support beam, that the lock might have existed for the opposite reason entirely, not to keep something safe inside the cellar, but to make absolutely certain nobody accidentally left that trapdoor open long enough for something to find its way up from underneath. That detail has sat with me uncomfortably ever since, because I had never once, in my exploration of that space, considered the cellar itself as anything other than storage, a room beneath the house rather than a room that might connect in some way I do not fully understand and have no desire to investigate further to whatever lies out past that tree line. I have since had the trapdoor reinforced with a second, heavier padlock of my own, not because I have any concrete evidence that doing so matters, but because after everything I have learned about this property, I have decided I would rather live with an irrational precaution than risk being wrong about which precautions actually count. I still have not sold the house, even though the market in that county has been reasonably strong the last couple of years, and I have received 2 decent offers I probably should have taken more seriously than I did. Every time I get close to signing paperwork, I think about handing this place off to a family with young children who have no idea what my grandmother spent 60 years training herself and her descendants to never do out behind that house after dark, and I cannot bring myself to go through with it. I have thought about leaving some kind of written warning behind for whoever eventually does buy it, the way my grandmother left her tally marks and her careful, guarded journal entries for whoever came after her. But I have not yet figured out how to phrase something like that in a way that would not simply get dismissed as the eccentric ramblings of a previous owner, exactly the way I myself might have dismissed it a few years ago before I understood, in the most direct way possible, exactly how much truth was carved into that old cellar beam. For now, the house sits mostly empty, visited only for maintenance a few times a year, fence line finally repaired, but the woods behind it left otherwise undisturbed, and I keep my own private version of my grandmother's rule, firmly in place every single time I am there, after dusk, no matter how minor the pain or the frustration. Because I have heard with my own ears exactly what happens when that rule gets broken, and I have no interest in ever testing how patient whatever lives back in those trees actually is. I think more than anything else about how ordinary that whole property looks from the road, a plain farmhouse, a plain fence line, nothing about the exterior that would ever suggest to a passing stranger that generations of one family spent their entire lives carefully managing a rule about silence that most people would never think to question, let alone follow. My grandmother lived 60 years on that land, and by every outward account lived an ordinary, quiet life, and it is only now, going through what she left behind, that I understand just how much careful, deliberate discipline that ordinary, quiet life actually required of her, every single day for 6 full decades. We are halfway through, and I know some of you are already sleeping with the light on tonight. That is exactly the reaction I want. If you have made it this far, do me a favor and like this video right now, so I know to keep making these. And if you are not subscribed yet, I genuinely don't know what you're waiting for. Comment below if you or someone in your family has ever had an experience like these. I read every single one, and some of you end up becoming future episodes. 4 more stories left, and they get worse. Story 7. My name is Bartholomew Nkemelu, and I install and service satellite internet equipment across some of the most remote properties in the Blue Ridge region. a job that exists specifically because so many rural households out that way have no access to traditional broadband and rely entirely on satellite service for any kind of reliable connection. It is a job that takes me to places most other service technicians in the company flatly refuse to cover: long unpaved drives, properties with no clear address beyond a set of coordinates, customers who sometimes have to physically meet you at a gate because the actual house is not visible or reachable from any public road. I have done this work for 6 years and have seen more strange, isolated corners of these mountains than most people ever will. This is the one job that changed how I feel about doing this work at all. The property in question was about as remote as any I had serviced up to that point, deep enough into the Blue Ridge backcountry that my GPS lost the actual road entirely for the last 4 miles, leaving me following verbal directions the homeowner had given over the phone, landmarks rather than street names. Turn left at the burned-out silo. Follow the creek bed until the second bridge. I finally reached a locked gate where the homeowner, a quiet older man named Wendell Aldercott, was waiting for me in person, which itself was slightly unusual. Most customers just leave a gate code rather than meeting a tech in person. But Wendell explained briefly that the gate code system did not work reliably out there, and he preferred to lead service vehicles and himself to avoid confusion. I did not think much of it at the time, beyond noting it as one more small oddity of a genuinely odd, isolated property. The job itself was fairly standard in terms of the technical work involved, mounting a new dish on the roof of his single-story cabin, which sat in a small cleared area surrounded on all sides by dense, old-growth hemlock forest, trees old enough and tall enough that even at midday, the clearing sat in a kind of perpetual dim shade, sunlight only reaching the ground in scattered patches where gaps in the canopy happened to align just right. Wendell stayed close by while I worked, ostensibly to help hand up tools and hold the ladder steady, but I noticed early on that he kept glancing toward the tree line at the edge of his clearing, repeatedly, almost compulsively, a kind of distracted vigilance that made me uneasy without him ever saying a single word to explain it. I chalked it up at first to general rural caution, maybe concerns about bears or other wildlife wandering close to the house, common enough in that kind of setting. Around mid-afternoon, while I was up on the ladder against the side of his cabin, running cable down from the newly mounted dish, I heard what sounded unmistakably like children laughing somewhere back in the trees, several distinct voices overlapping in that particular high-pitched, playful cadence of kids at genuine play, the kind of sound that instinctively makes an adult smile before any conscious thought kicks in. I called down to Wendell, half joking, asking if there were kids around I should be careful of with the ladder and the tools scattered around the worksite. He went pale, visibly the color actually draining from his face, in a way I have honestly never seen happen to another adult in real time before or since. And he told me flatly, in a voice with none of his earlier friendliness left in it, to ignore it, keep working, do not look toward the sound, and above all, do not answer if it calls out actual words. I laughed nervously, assuming this was some kind of local joke I was not fully in on, a Blue Ridge version of ribbing the new guy. He did not laugh back, did not even crack a small smile to suggest he was joking, just stared at me with an intensity that killed my own nervous laugh in my throat. I kept working, trying to focus on the cable run rather than the sound, but over the course of the next couple of minutes, the laughing shifted gradually and unmistakably into something that mimicked crying instead, the same overlapping quality of multiple voices, but now pitched toward distress rather than play. A sound that hit some deep, instinctive nerve in me, despite every conscious part of my brain insisting this was not actually children in danger somewhere in those woods. Then, abruptly, the crying cut off entirely, and a single voice called out clearly from somewhere back in the trees, "Help us, please," in a tone that did not match either the laughing or the crying that had come immediately before it. flatter somehow, like three separate recordings of genuine human sound had been spliced together by something that understood the individual components of human distress without fully understanding how they were actually supposed to flow together into something coherent. Wendell did not so much as glance toward the sound. He kept his eyes fixed on me, on the cable, on the work, deliberately and visibly refusing to acknowledge the tree line at all. And he said one thing to me, quiet and firm: "Just keep your eyes on that cable, son, and finish the job." I finished running that cable faster than I probably needed to. Hands not quite steady, and neither one of us said another word about it until the install was fully complete and we were both standing back near my service truck. The dish mounted, the connection tested, and confirmed working. Once we were safely back near the truck, gate visible in the distance, Wendell finally explained in a low voice, like he still did not fully trust the open air around his own property, that whatever lived in those woods had been doing that same routine for as long as he had owned the land, going on 22 years by his account, testing different combinations of sounds, different emotional registers, seemingly trying to find whatever specific combination would successfully draw a person out past the tree line to investigate. He said it never seemed to have quite mastered the transitions between different human sounds, laughing, sliding into crying, sliding into pleading, with a kind of unnatural abruptness that a real person's genuine emotional shifts never actually have, which he had come to believe, over 2 decades of living beside it, was actually the one saving grace of the whole situation, because a person paying close enough attention could usually tell something was off if they knew to listen for exactly that kind of seam between the sounds. He told me about 2 hikers who had wandered onto his land completely by accident, maybe a decade back, following what they later described to the one who survived as the sound of a child crying somewhere off the main trail, convinced they were about to find a lost kid in genuine danger. Wendell had heard the commotion from his cabin and gotten out there as fast as he could manage. But by the time he reached them, it was already too late for one of the 2 hikers, gone into the tree line after the sound, despite his companion's frantic attempts to stop him, and never seen again despite an extensive search effort in the following days that Wendell himself had quietly assisted with, careful never to lead the search team anywhere too close to the specific stretch of woods he privately suspected was actually responsible. I finished that install and left well before dark, driving faster than the rough gravel road really allowed for safety. And I've declined every single service call routed to that general region of the county since that day, always citing a scheduling conflict or a territory boundary issue to my supervisor. Never the real reason, because I genuinely do not believe anyone at the company would take the real reason seriously enough to honor it as a legitimate excuse. I did, however, follow up with Wendell myself about a month later, calling the number on file for his account under the pretense of a standard post-install service check. Though really, I just wanted to know if he was doing all right out there and whether anything had changed since my visit. He seemed almost grateful for the call, said very few people ever asked him directly about it once they left his property. Most techs and delivery drivers who had heard the sounds themselves, preferring to simply never come back rather than discuss it further. He told me a few more details that day that he had not mentioned during my actual visit, including that the voices seemed to specifically target whoever was newest to the property at any given time, focusing their efforts on unfamiliar visitors rather than on him directly, which he theorized was because he had lived there long enough to be thoroughly recognized as someone who would not respond, no matter what was tried, making him a poor use of whatever effort the thing in the woods was expending. He also told me something that has stuck with me more than almost anything else from that whole encounter, which is that in the earliest years of owning that property, before he fully understood what he was dealing with, he had made the mistake of calling back toward the tree line one evening after hearing what sounded exactly like his own young daughter's voice calling for him, only to realize with a cold, sinking horror, partway through his response, that his daughter had been safely inside the house with her mother the entire time, nowhere near those woods at all. He would not tell me exactly what happened in the minutes immediately after that realization, just that it was the closest he ever came in 22 years of living there to losing something he could never have gotten back, and that the experience was what finally taught him, permanently and completely, never to answer that tree line again under any circumstances, no matter whose voice it borrowed or how convincing the plea sounded. I have not taken a service call anywhere near that county since, and I do not intend to, no matter how the territory assignments shift over the coming years. I have thought a great deal in the time since about the specific mechanics of how something like that could possibly learn to reproduce human voices with such precision, down to individual family nicknames, and the particular way a specific child's laugh sounds. My working theory, for whatever a service technician's amateur speculation is worth, is that it has simply been listening for a very long time. Longer than Wendell's 22 years, longer probably than anyone currently living has been observing that specific stretch of woods, patiently gathering fragments of sound from every person unlucky enough to wander close enough to be overheard, building up some kind of library it can draw from and recombine, imperfectly, the way I heard that afternoon. Laughing, sliding too abruptly into crying, sliding too abruptly into a plea for help. It does not need to understand human emotion to mimic the sounds of it. It just needs enough raw material to draw from, and 2 decades or 2 centuries, for all any of us actually know, is more than enough time to build a substantial library out of an isolated hollow that most people are smart enough to only ever visit once. Some jobs simply are not worth whatever a good customer review might be worth, against the risk of finding out firsthand exactly how convincing that tree line can get on a bad day. And I have made my peace with the territory assignments I have lost as a result of turning that region down, because peace of mind, it turns out, is worth considerably more to me than a slightly larger service radius on my monthly route sheet. I still think, more than anything, about the seam in those recombined sounds Wendell taught me to listen for. The small, abrupt break between the laughing and the crying and the pleading that gave away the mimicry if you knew what you were listening for. I have caught myself more than once since listening a little too carefully to ordinary sounds in ordinary places, checking without meaning to for that same unnatural seam, and finding, thankfully, nothing but the normal, imperfect flow of real human sound every single time. I hope it stays that way. I do not expect it will forever. Not in a region where something has apparently had over 2 decades, and likely far longer, to keep refining exactly what it sounds like to be believed. I still carry a small handheld radio in my service truck now, tuned to a local emergency scanner frequency, not because I expect it to ever pick up anything relevant to what happened at Wendell's property, but because the habit of listening carefully, of paying close attention to the texture and rhythm of voices, rather than just their surface content, has stuck with me in a way I did not anticipate when I first left that job site years ago. My coworkers occasionally tease me about it, ask why a satellite technician needs a scanner radio running quietly in the cab all day. And I have never given any of them the real answer, just some vague comment about liking to know what is happening around the county. The real answer is that I never want to be caught off guard again by a voice that almost sounds right, and keeping my ear trained on the genuine, imperfect texture of real emergency traffic feels like the closest thing to practice I can manage for a threat I hope I never actually have to identify in the field again. I have wondered more than once whether Wendell himself is still all right out there, whether the 22 years of quiet, careful vigilance he described to me that afternoon has held steady in the time since my own single visit, or whether something has eventually worn through even that much practiced resistance. I have thought about reaching out again, checking in properly rather than the one brief follow-up call I made. But every time I consider it, I find myself reluctant to dial that number, Some part of me worried about what I might hear on the other end, or what I might not hear at all. For now, I simply hope, from a comfortable distance, that he is still there, still careful, still refusing to look toward that tree line, no matter what it tries next. Story 8. My name is Marisol Gutenberg, and I work as a veterinarian specializing in livestock, running a mobile practice that takes me between farms scattered across a wide rural stretch of southern West Virginia, mostly cattle and goats with the occasional call about horses or hogs mixed in. It is a job that has shown me plenty of genuinely strange things over the years. Ordinary strange, the kind explainable by disease or parasite, or simple bad luck. A farmer's whole herd hit by something environmental, an outbreak nobody saw coming. This story is not that kind of strange, and it remains more than a decade into my career, the single farm call I still think about more than any other I have ever billed for. The farm belonged to a woman named Faye Castellanos, a third-generation cattle operation on land her family had worked for close to 70 years, and she had called me out specifically because several of her cattle had gone missing over the span of about a month, a pattern that made no immediate sense given the evidence, or rather the complete absence of evidence, available to explain it. No fence damage anywhere along her perimeter that would suggest animals wandering off through a gap. No predator tracks consistent with anything large enough to be taking full-grown cattle, no coyote sign, no confirmed bear activity in that specific area that season. Nothing that fit the pattern of livestock loss she had documented in her own careful records going back weeks. I arrived at her property right around dusk, which was not my preferred time for a farm visit, but was the only window that worked with both our schedules that particular week, her having spent the day dealing with equipment repairs and me having a full slate of other appointments earlier in the day. While I worked through examining the remaining herd, checking for any signs of underlying stress, illness, or injury that might explain unusual behavior contributing to the losses, Faye mentioned almost offhandedly, in the tone of someone bringing up something she was not entirely comfortable saying out loud, but felt she needed to mention anyway, that she had started hearing something calling to her cattle at night over the preceding several weeks. A low, bellowing sound almost identical to the distress call a cow makes when separated from the herd or in genuine physical trouble, except this one was consistently coming from the same general direction, the dense tree line running along the far end of her largest pasture. She said the cattle responded to it every single time, the whole herd or a significant portion of it lifting their heads in unison and beginning to drift toward the sound in a slow, unhurried group. Not the frantic movement of animals responding to an actual threat or an actual distressed herd mate, but something calmer, almost dreamlike in its lack of urgency, and that this pattern of drifting toward the sound was when the numbers had started quietly dropping, an animal or two unaccounted for after each occurrence, never found, never any trace left behind to explain where they had actually gone. While I was finishing up my examination of the herd, just as the light was fading fully into that deep blue-colored dusk takes on right before true dark sets in, I heard it myself for the first time. A deep, guttural lowing call came from somewhere in the tree line Faye had described, and I watched, professionally fascinated despite the growing unease in my gut, as every single animal in that pasture lifted its head at almost exactly the same moment and began walking calm and unhurried toward the section of fence closest to where the sound had originated. It did not look like a startled or distressed reaction at all. It looked closer to the kind of slow, magnetic pull you see in a herd responding to feed being delivered, purposeful but entirely without urgency or fear, which in context was somehow far more unsettling than panic would have been. Faye grabbed my arm firmly and told me in a low, tense voice not to make any sudden movements or loud noises, just to help her get the interior gate closed between the drifting herd and the section of fence line closest to the tree line before they actually reached it. We worked fast and mostly in silence, her taking the ATV to circle wide and start pushing the rear of the herd, while I moved on foot along the flank closer to the barn, both of us working to redirect that slow, hypnotic drift back away from the tree line and toward the interior gate that would cut off their access to that entire section of pasture. We managed to get the gate closed just as the lowing sound coming from the woods changed, mid-call, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight up even through my jacket sleeve. It shifted from that deep, convincingly bovine register into something unmistakably not bovine at all, a deeper, wetter tone that trailed off at the end into what genuinely sounded, carried faintly on the evening wind, like something close to laughter, low and satisfied, the kind of sound that made my whole body go cold, standing there in the gathering dark with a latched metal gate is the only thing separating us from whatever had just made it. Faye let out a long breath once the gate was secured, hands visibly shaking slightly on the top rail, and told me that was the third time that season she had managed to successfully turn the herd back before losing another one, and that she had honestly lost count of how many times before that season she had not managed it in time, the losses simply becoming an expected, if deeply unwelcome, cost of running cattle on that particular stretch of land, a cost her own father and grandfather had apparently also quietly absorbed without ever fully explaining why to anyone outside the immediate family. I have treated a lot of genuinely strange livestock ailments across more than a decade of practice. Parasites that defy easy diagnosis, injuries with causes nobody can fully reconstruct, disease outbreaks that spread in patterns science struggles to fully explain even after the fact. I have never billed for a farm call quite like that one. I asked Faye, once we were both back inside her farmhouse kitchen with strong coffee in hand, and our nerves gradually settling, why she had never reported the losses to anyone beyond her own insurance company, no wildlife officials, no county extension office, nothing that might have brought outside attention or assistance to a problem that had clearly been going on far longer than one season. She told me with a tired kind of resignation in her voice that suggested this was a conversation she had already had with herself many times over, that her father had tried exactly that decades earlier, back when the losses first started during his own tenure running the farm, and had been treated politely but unmistakably as a man whose grief or stress or plain bad luck was leading him toward unreliable explanations. Coyotes, they told him. Maybe a mountain lion passing through, rare, but not impossible that far into the backcountry. Nobody took his description of a calling sound seriously enough to actually investigate it. And after enough of those conversations, he stopped bringing it up entirely, choosing instead to simply build the losses into his operating costs and warn his own children quietly and privately, exactly the way Faye had eventually warned her own daughter, about which sounds to never respond to and which sections of pasture to keep a closer eye on once the light started fading. She told me one more detail before I left that night, something she said she had never shared with anyone outside her immediate family before, which was that on one occasion, years before I ever started servicing her farm, she had actually gone looking, driven by frustration and a stubborn refusal to just accept the losses the way her father had, walking the tree line in full daylight to look for any physical evidence at all, tracks, remains, and anything that might point toward a mundane predator she could actually address through normal means. She found nothing along the fence line itself, but deeper into the trees, maybe 60 or 70 yards past her property boundary, she found a small clearing where the grass grew unnaturally sparse and pale, almost bleached looking, in a rough circular patch about the size of a small room. And scattered around the edges of that clearing were bones, old and weathered enough that she could not determine with any confidence how long they had been there or what species they had originally belonged to, though she was fairly confident, based on general size and shape, that at least some of them were bovine. She never went back to that clearing again, and she made me promise, somewhat unnecessarily given my own complete lack of interest in doing so, that I would never go looking for it myself out of professional curiosity. I have kept that promise easily, without a single moment of temptation, and I still service her farm to this day, though I have learned to schedule my visits earlier in the day whenever her calendar allows for it. The professional side of me has spent a fair amount of time since that night trying to construct some kind of rational framework for what I witnessed, because that is simply how my training has shaped me to process unusual observations, always reaching first for the explanation grounded in biology or behavior before accepting anything outside of that. I have considered whether some combination of infrasound, frequencies below the range of normal human hearing that certain animals respond to strongly might explain the herd's calm, drifting response to the calling sound. Some environmental phenomenon amplified by the terrain of that particular hollow that happens to mimic bovine distress calls closely enough to trigger a herding instinct. It is not an entirely satisfying theory, and it does nothing to explain the low, wet laughter I heard trailing off at the end of that call, or the bones scattered around the edge of that unnaturally pale clearing Faye described finding, but it is the closest thing to a rational framework I have managed to build, and most nights it is enough to let me sleep without dwelling on it further. Other nights, usually after a farm call somewhere else entirely that happens to end near dusk, I find myself thinking again about the specific quality of that calm in the herd, the total absence of fear in animals that are, under almost any other circumstance, deeply attuned to danger and quick to react to it. Cattle spook easily at unfamiliar sounds, unfamiliar smells, sudden movement, and yet that entire herd walk toward an unfamiliar sound with the same unhurried trust they reserve for their own routine feeding schedule, which suggests to me more than any infrasound theory ever could, that whatever was calling them had earned that trust somehow, through repetition, through consistency, through however many seasons of careful, patient calling it had taken to convince an entire herd that the sound coming from that tree line was something safe to walk toward, rather than something to be wary of. That thought is the one that actually keeps me up some nights, more than the laughter, more than the bones. Not that something out there is capable of luring cattle to their deaths, which is unsettling enough on its own, but that it has apparently had the patience, generation after generation, of Castellano's family cattle, to build that trust slowly and deliberately rather than simply resorting to force or panic. The same patient, practiced quality I have heard described by other people who have shared their own strange encounters from these same mountains. Whatever it is, it does not appear to be in any particular hurry, and it does not appear to need to be, which is its own quiet kind of horror once you sit with it long enough. I keep a small folded note in my truck now, tucked into the visor, a habit I picked up not long after that visit, listing which of my regular farm calls need to be scheduled before a certain hour depending on the season and the light. Faye's farm sits near the very top of that list, timed to always finish with plenty of daylight left to spare, and I have never once had to explain that particular scheduling preference to a client who did not already understand exactly why it mattered. I have also, quietly and without ever explaining my full reasoning to any of them directly, adjusted how I handle a handful of my other, more remote farm accounts since that visit, paying closer attention now to any client who mentions unexplained livestock losses without an obvious predator or disease explanation, asking a few more careful follow-up questions than I might have before, listening specifically for any mention of unusual calls or sounds drifting from a tree line right around dusk. I have not found another situation that matches what happened at Faye's place exactly, not yet, but I no longer assume, the way I might have earlier in my career, that an unexplained pattern of loss, simply a diagnostic puzzle, waiting for the right combination of tests to solve it. Sometimes, I have come to understand, the most useful question a rural vet can ask: A struggling client is not about the animals themselves at all, but about what the client has personally heard alone at the edge of their own property right around the time the losses first started. It has changed the way I practice medicine in this region more broadly, honestly, in ways I would not have predicted before that one dusk visit to Faye's farm. I used to think of my job purely in terms of biology, pathology, nutrition, the concrete measurable factors that explain why an animal is thriving or struggling. I still believe in all of that completely. It remains the foundation of everything I actually do for a living. But I hold it a little more loosely now than I used to, with a little more room left over for the possibility that not every unexplained pattern of loss in these mountains is going to resolve itself through a blood panel or a fecal sample, and that sometimes the most important diagnostic tool I carry with me is simply the willingness to take a rural client seriously when they tell me quietly and a little embarrassed exactly what they have heard calling from their own tree line at dusk. Story 9. My name is Desmond Ochterberg, and I work as a licensed land surveyor, mapping property boundaries across a handful of rural counties for real estate transactions, estate settlements, and the occasional boundary dispute that ends up requiring formal documentation for a courtroom. It is precise, methodical work, long days spent alone in the field, running lines with a total station and a bag of stakes. The kind of job that rewards patience and attention to detail far more than it rewards imagination. This story happened while surveying a large, undeveloped parcel in the mountains of North Carolina, land that had sat unsold for almost 30 years, according to the listing history. Despite being genuinely attractive acreage by most conventional measures, decent elevation, good tree cover, a year-round creek running through the lower section. According to the listing agent who had hired my firm to produce an updated boundary survey ahead of a fresh attempt at marketing the property, buyers kept backing out after visiting the land in person, consistently and repeatedly over 3 decades, without ever giving a clear or consistent reason why. Financing fell through for some. Others simply stopped returning calls after a single site visit. The agent, a practical woman who had clearly grown tired of trying to explain the pattern to her own supervisors, told me flatly before I ever set foot on the property that she did not expect me to find anything unusual. Just wanted clean, updated documentation to support the next listing attempt. But she also mentioned, almost as an aside, that she personally avoided walking the back half of the parcel alone whenever she could help it, without offering any further explanation for that particular preference. I was working alone with my equipment, as is standard for most of my routine boundary work, running a line through dense forests that had clearly not seen much human foot traffic in a very long time. Undergrowth thick enough in places that I had to detour around sections rather than push straight through. About 4 hours into what I had planned as a full day of fieldwork, I came across a section where the trees themselves looked wrong in a way that stopped me mid-stride before I had fully processed why. Dozens of trees in a rough circle, maybe 60 feet across by my rough visual estimate, had grown with a distinct, consistent spiral twist running the full length of their trunks, every single one curving in the same direction, a pattern that is not something that occurs naturally without some kind of consistent external force acting on all of them over what had to be many decades of growth. Prevailing wind patterns in that particular hollow, perhaps. Though even that explanation felt inadequate once I was actually standing inside the formation looking up at it. Stepping into that circle, the temperature dropped noticeably, enough of a change that I could see my own breath fogging in front of me despite the fact that it was a genuinely mild afternoon everywhere else on the property, warm enough that I had been sweating through my shirt just minutes before crossing into that space. My compass, an old analog backup I keep clipped to my pack for situations where my electronic equipment might need cross-checking, began behaving strangely the moment I stepped inside the circle, the needle drifting in a slow, lazy rotation instead of settling toward magnetic north, the way it reliably had for every other reading I had taken that entire day, both before and after that specific location. More than the temperature drop, more than the compass, what unsettled me most was an overwhelming physical sense that I was being watched, not from one specific direction the way you would expect if a single animal or person were observing you from cover, but from every direction simultaneously, an ambient, diffuse attention that seemed to come from the space itself, rather than from any identifiable source I could point my own attention toward and confront directly. I have spent thousands of hours alone in a remote forest over the course of my career, and I know the specific prickling feeling of being watched by wildlife, a bear or a curious bobcat holding still in cover nearby. This was not that. This felt less like being watched by something hidden and more like being watched by the trees themselves, by the ground, by the strange quality of the air inside that circle. A sensation I have never experienced before or since in any other stretch of forest, however remote or unfamiliar. I packed up my equipment quickly, moving with more urgency than the situation strictly demanded on paper, and marked that entire section of the survey as unbuildable due to unstable terrain, which was not entirely a lie given the genuinely uneven ground in that specific area, just not the complete truth of my actual reasoning for excluding it from the buildable acreage calculations. I relocated my work to the opposite end of the property for the remainder of that day, and finished the bulk of the boundary work over the following 2 days without incident, deliberately routing my daily approach to avoid passing anywhere near that spiral circle again, adding a fair amount of extra hiking distance to my route each day that I considered entirely worth the inconvenience. When I mentioned the spiral trees to an older surveyor back at my firm's office, a man who had been doing this work across that same general region for close to 40 years and had surveyed more remote acreage in these mountains than probably anyone else currently practicing in the state, he went quiet in a way that immediately told me I had touched on something he took seriously, rather than something he was about to dismiss as an overactive imagination on a long solo day in the field. He told me that formation has an actual name among old-timers and long-time surveyors who have worked this particular region long enough to have encountered it themselves. They call it a witness ring, and the stories passed down through several generations of local surveyors say something uses that ring specifically to watch whoever wanders too close, taking its time deciding whether the person is worth following home afterward. He told me he had personally encountered 2 other witness rings over the course of his own career, both in different counties, both on land that had similarly struggled to sell despite otherwise reasonable market conditions, and that in both cases he had done exactly what I instinctively did, marked the areas unsuitable for building and rerouted his work to avoid spending any more time inside the formation than the initial discovery had already required. He said he had never personally experienced anything beyond the cold and the compass trouble and the sensation of being watched, the same 3 things I had experienced myself, but that he had heard secondhand accounts, never confirmed to his satisfaction, but consistent enough across multiple unrelated sources that he no longer dismissed them outright, of hunters and hikers who had lingered too long inside a witness ring, reporting a strange compulsion afterwards to return to that exact spot again and again, sometimes over a period of years, an inexplicable pullback toward a place that offered them nothing beneficial and that they could not otherwise account for. I finished that survey job without further incident, delivered clean, accurate documentation for the parcel's buildable acreage, and collected my fee without ever mentioning the witness ring in any official capacity, beyond the vague terrain notation already on record. But I made sure every future site visit to that property or to any adjacent parcels in that same general hollow kept me well clear of that specific circle, and I never went back in alone, not even years later when a separate, unrelated survey job for a neighboring property would have made a shortcut through that section of forest genuinely convenient. Some convenience, I have learned, is simply not worth the cost of finding out exactly how patient that kind of watching can turn out to be. I asked the older surveyor, before that conversation ended, whether he thought the persistent selling difficulty on properties containing a witness ring was actually connected to whatever caused the sensation inside the circle itself, whether prospective buyers were somehow picking up on the same wrongness I had felt, even without ever finding the specific formation responsible for it. He thought about that for a while before answering in the careful, considered way of a man who had clearly turned the same question over in his own mind many times across 4 decades of fieldwork. He said his honest belief, for whatever an old surveyor's belief is worth against actual evidence, was that it was not really about the buyers sensing anything specific or identifiable at all. He thought it was simpler and stranger than that. The land carrying one of these formations just does not want to be sold, does not want new owners clearing it and building on it and changing the character of ground that something has apparently claimed a long-term interest in maintaining exactly as it is. He said in both of the cases he personally knew of, the properties eventually did sell, decades later than a normal listing would take, but only after being subdivided in ways that conveniently left the specific acreage containing the witness ring itself as unbuildable common space or protected easement, almost like the land had a way of steering its own outcome, regardless of what any individual buyer or seller actually wanted. I do not know whether to take that theory seriously as anything more than an old man's colorful way of framing a genuinely strange coincidence, but I have noticed, checking back on that North Carolina parcels listing history a couple of years after my own survey work there, that it did eventually sell at a steep discount from the original asking price to a buyer who purchased the front 2/3 of the acreage for a modest cabin build and left the rear section, including the exact stretch of forest where I found that spiral circle, entirely undeveloped and folded into a conservation easement that the new owner apparently insisted on as a condition of the sale, for reasons that were never made public in any of the transaction paperwork I was able to access. I have my own private theory about those reasons, and I suspect, though I have never confirmed it directly, that the buyer's survey crew encountered exactly what I did and made exactly the same quiet decision I made, to draw a boundary line around whatever that circle actually is and simply leave it alone. I still carry that old analog compass clipped to my pack on every job now, not just as a backup for my electronic equipment, the way I originally justified buying it, but because I have found I genuinely want a second, simpler way of noticing if something in a given patch of forest is not behaving the way it should. I have not encountered another witness ring since that North Carolina job, though I have found myself more than once on unrelated surveys in unrelated counties, stopping mid-stride in dense, unfamiliar forests for no clear reason at all. Some half-formed instinct telling me to check my compass before continuing forward, and every single time since, thankfully, the needle has settled exactly where it should. I do not know if that means I have simply gotten lucky, or if that particular formation truly is as rare as the older surveyor's own limited experience across 4 decades would suggest. Either way, I check the compass every time the feeling rises now, and I have promised myself that the day it stops settling properly again, I will turn around and walk out exactly as fast as I did the first time. Documentation be damned. I have also started, in the years since that job, quietly noting on my own private field records, separate from any official client deliverable, whenever a property I'm surveying shows a documented history of unusually slow sales or repeated buyer withdrawals, the same pattern that first prompted the listing agent to bring me in on that North Carolina parcel. I have accumulated a small handful of these notes across several different counties now, properties with no obvious defect, explaining their difficulty selling, no environmental hazard, no title complication, nothing that would show up on any standard due diligence checklist. I have not gone looking for witness rings on any of them, and I do not intend to, but I keep the list anyway, tucked away with my own private records, a quiet catalog of ground that seems, for reasons I cannot officially document, unusually reluctant to change hands. I have never shown that list to anyone else at my firm, and I do not plan to, both because I doubt it would be taken seriously as anything more than an odd personal hobby, and because part of me suspects that some ground genuinely does prefer to be left exactly as it is, watched over by whatever has claimed a long-term interest in keeping it that way, and that the smartest thing a person in my line of work can do, once they recognize that pattern for what it likely is simply respect the boundary and move on to the next job without asking too many further questions. Story 10. My name is Charlene Ferrante, and I work as a night shift dispatcher for a volunteer fire department covering a wide stretch of rural Appalachian territory, coordinating response and logging incoming calls for a handful of small, spread-out towns that share resources, because none of them individually has the population base to fully staff their own department around the clock. I have worked this job for going on 9 years now, most of that time on the overnight shift specifically because the pay differential helps and because, honestly, I've always preferred the quiet pace of the late hours compared to the constant churn of daytime calls. This story happened on a slow winter night a few years back, and it remains the one call in 9 years of dispatch work that I have never fully been able to explain, file away, or fully stop thinking about. The call came in on a landline, which itself was mildly unusual by that point, since the overwhelming majority of our incoming calls by then were cell calls. But rural areas often have more legacy landline infrastructure still active than people expect. Elderly residents especially tending to keep a home phone line, even after most everyone else in their family has switched entirely to mobile. The number that came through was registered in our system to an address that, according to our own internal records, had been formally condemned and marked unoccupied for over 15 years, a detail I noticed almost immediately on my dispatch screen even before I had fully processed what the caller herself was saying. The caller was an elderly-sounding woman, voice thin and slightly quavering in the particular way that often comes with genuine age. And she said clearly and calmly that she smelled smoke in her house and needed someone sent out immediately. I followed standard procedure exactly as I would for any incoming call, keeping her on the line while I simultaneously dispatched the nearest available unit, gathering additional details about the smoke, whether she could see visible flame, whether she was able to safely exit the residence on her own if needed. Something about the call felt off to me, almost from the very first exchange, though it took me a few minutes of active dispatch work to fully identify what specifically was bothering me, because on the surface, everything about her responses was coherent, appropriately worried without being panicked, exactly the kind of measured reporting you would expect from a competent elderly caller experiencing a genuine but not yet critical emergency. What actually unsettled me was the background noise behind her voice, a faint, overlapping murmur that I could just barely make out beneath her words, like several other people were present in the room with her, speaking too quietly and too indistinctly for me to make out any actual words, even though she had told me clearly, when I asked as part of standard protocol, that she lived entirely alone and had no other household members to account for in the response plan. The responding crew reached the address within about 11 minutes, which was a reasonable response time given the rural distances involved, and I stayed on the line with the caller that entire time, relaying updates on the crew's progress as they became available through the radio. When the crew actually arrived on scene, they found exactly what our own condemned property records had already indicated: a dark, clearly abandoned structure. No smoke visible anywhere, no signs of any active fire or even recent habitation. Roof partially collapsed on one side, consistent with over a decade of neglect. Windows either boarded or simply gone entirely. the whole structure sitting silent and lightless against the winter dark. I relayed this information to the caller as gently as I could manage, expecting some confusion or distress on her end, once she understood the crew was not finding what she had described. Instead, she insisted with the same calm, matter-of-fact certainty she had maintained through the entire call that the crew was standing right outside her window at that very moment, and asked me in a tone that had shifted from worried to something closer to confused hurt why they were not simply coming to the door to help her. I relayed her description back to the crew lead over radio, and he confirmed there was, in fact, no door standing intact on that particular side of the structure at all. Just open, exposed framing where a door and its surrounding wall section had clearly collapsed some years earlier, long before that night. The call disconnected on her end abruptly, mid-sentence, cutting off in the middle of a question I never got to hear the end of. When our system automatically attempted to trace the originating line immediately afterward, standard procedure for any call that disconnects unexpectedly during an active dispatch, it came back with no active service on record for that number at all, confirming that the landline itself had been formally disconnected along with the rest of the abandoned property well over a decade earlier, consistent with the condemned status already showing in our address records before the call had ever come through. I have worked dispatch for going on 9 years at this point, and taken more than my fair share of calls I could never fully explain to my own satisfaction afterward. Prank calls that turned out to be something stranger, confused elderly callers reporting things that never quite matched what responding crews actually found on scene. But that is the only call in 9 years where I still have the original audio saved, pulled, and archived from our system before routine data retention policy would have otherwise overwritten it, and I have never once, in all the time since, been able to bring myself to listen to it again all the way through from start to finish. Especially not that faint background murmur behind her voice, which every single time I have started to listen back, seemed to get just slightly louder during each pause she took to breathe between her sentences. I asked around quietly among a few of the more senior volunteers at the department in the weeks following that call, careful about how I framed the question since I did not want to come across as someone whose nerves could not handle a strange but ultimately explainable overnight shift. A couple of the older guys, men who had been with the department for decades and had responded to more genuinely bizarre calls over the years than I could easily count myself, told me they were not surprised at all to hear that particular address had generated a call like that, because it apparently was not the first time. One of them, a longtime engine captain nearing retirement, told me he had personally responded to that same condemned property on 2 separate occasions years apart, both times following reports phoned in describing an active emergency, smoke on one call, a reported fall on the other, and both times finding the exact same dark, silent, thoroughly abandoned structure, with no evidence whatsoever of the situation described. He told me the property had a specific history in that community that predated the department's own records. A woman had died alone in that house decades earlier, sometime in the years before the structure was ever formally condemned, discovered only after neighbors noticed her mail had gone uncollected for an unusually long stretch, and that the circumstances of that original death had never been fully settled to the satisfaction of everyone in the community. Some persistent rumor about the timeline not quite adding up, about the responding officers at the time noting things in the house that suggested she had not been alone for as long as everyone assumed before she was finally found. He did not have any more specific detail to offer beyond that general shape of the story, decades-old gossip passed down through people who had mostly since passed away themselves. But he said it was enough, combined with his own 2 strange calls to that same address, to make him deeply uncomfortable every time a call came in referencing that particular property. Uncomfortable enough that he always volunteered to lead the responding crew himself, rather than let a newer volunteer handle it alone. I still keep that original saved audio file archived on a separate drive at home, unable to bring myself to delete it entirely. Despite years of unease every time I think about its continued existence, and equally unable to bring myself to ever finish listening through it, start to finish the way I have attempted and failed to do on 3 or 4 separate occasions since that winter night. I know the general shape of what is on that recording. I've heard enough of it in fragments, stopping partway through each attempt, to know exactly how the background murmur behaves, how it swells during her pauses and recedes slightly when she is actively speaking, as though it is somehow synchronized to her breathing in a way that no ordinary background noise, television, radio, another person in the next room would ever naturally behave. I do not know what that woman was or what was in that dark, collapsed house alongside her voice that night, calling in on a disconnected line from an address that has sat formally abandoned for well over 15 years. I only know that I have logged thousands of calls across 9 years on this job, and that call remains the only one I am not willing to fully listen to again, and the only one I still think about, unprompted, on quiet overnight shifts, when the radio traffic goes still and the dispatch center gets just a little too silent for comfort. Our department eventually flagged that address in our internal system with a special notation, something we have only done a handful of times in the department's history, instructing dispatchers to still send a unit if a call ever comes through referencing that location, because we cannot in good conscience simply ignore a reported emergency, no matter how strange the calling history has been, but also instructing us to note in the call log, discreetly, that the address carries a documented pattern of unexplained reports, so that whoever ends up on shift the next time that number lights up on the screen has at least some warning of what they might be walking into. I have been the one to add 2 more entries to that log myself in the years since my own call, both from other dispatchers who experienced almost exactly what I did. The same calm, elderly voice, the same faint synchronized murmur beneath her words, the same abrupt disconnection once the responding crew confirmed there was nothing there to find. None of us who have taken that call have ever compared notes about it out loud, beyond the bare facts required for the official log, and I think, honestly, that is exactly how all of us prefer to keep it. I have thought many times about what it would mean to actually sit down with the other 2 dispatchers who logged similar calls and compare our full experiences in detail, rather than just the bare procedural facts required for the official record. But every time I have come close to suggesting it, something has held me back, a reluctance I cannot fully explain even to myself. Part of it, I think, is a simple wish to keep my own experience contained, private, something I can continue to tell myself was an unusual anomaly rather than confirming, through direct comparison, just how consistent and deliberate the pattern actually appears to be across multiple separate callers and multiple separate nights. Comparing notes would mean admitting fully and completely that this is not a strange one-time glitch in an old phone system, but something with enough consistency and intention behind it that 3 different dispatchers, working 9 years apart in some cases, all experienced essentially the same encounter down to small identical details neither of us could have known about in advance from the other's account. I do not know what actually answers that phone from inside a house that has had no functioning line for well over 15 years. I do not know why it specifically chooses an elderly, calm, believable voice, rather than anything more obviously frightening, or why the background murmur behaves the way it does, swelling during her pauses like something waiting just behind her for its own turn to speak. What I do know, after 9 years in this job, and one call I will never fully explain, is that some silences on the other end of a phone line are exactly what they sound like, and some are something else entirely, patiently waiting behind a familiar, trustworthy voice for someone on our end to finally stop asking questions and simply come inside. 10 stories, 10 different lives, and every single one of them still thinks about that night more than they will ever admit to most people. If one of these got to you, that means it did its job. And that is exactly the kind of story I want to keep bringing you. If you are still here, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next batch, and leave a comment telling me which story you would never want to live through yourself. If you have your own encounter, something you have never told anyone outside your family, send it my way. It might end up right here on Park Ranger Files. Stay safe out there, and don't answer if something calls your name from the tree line. See you next time.